The healers of the Iron Mark Capital had a saying: "You can treat anything in room 7 of the healing wing." Except him. Alpha King Kalen Ashvale was 33 years old, 6 feet and 4 inches of controlled, precise, absolute authority. The kind of man entire war councils lowered their voices around. The kind of man whose name alone caused border lords to reconsider their ambitions overnight. And behind the door of room 7 stood 9 royal guards, making sure no one forgot that. But tonight, the guards weren't watching the door. They were watching Senna's hands, because her hand was resting directly on the center of the long, jagged scar running the length of the Alpha King's spine. The scar no one had touched in 11 years. Not physicians from 3 territories. Not the royal surgeon who had flown in from the northern reaches. Not even the battle-hardened soldiers who had pulled him out of the burning, keep the night his enemies had tried to end his bloodline entirely. Every healer who had ever entered this room had stopped the moment their hands came close, because Kalen would simply look at them, and the appointment would end. But tonight, something different had happened, and Senna, newly appointed to the palace healing wing, 26 years old, an Omega from the southern settlement schools, who had spent her career treating people everyone else had given up on, hadn't known the story when she stepped into the room. Her hand had moved the way it always moved, calm, professional, automatic, until her palm landed directly on the thick ridge of scar tissue along his spine. The room froze. Behind her, one of the royal guards inhaled sharply. Another shifted his weight. A third moved his hand toward the blade at his hip, because no one in 11 years had placed their hand on those scars and kept it there, not for a single breath. Senna could feel the roughness beneath her fingers. The skin was dense and uneven, like old candle wax hardened over stone. Evidence of fire, evidence of something catastrophic, evidence of a night no one in this room was allowed to discuss. Her training told her to move, apologize, step back immediately. But something stopped her. Kalen's breathing had changed beneath her hand. Not angry, not violent. Still the way a man goes still when he finds himself inside a memory he hasn't visited in a very long time. One of the guards stepped forward. "My lady, you should move your hand." Another voice. Now. Senna did not move, because the Alpha King had not told her to. And then Kalen turned his head slowly. His dark gray eyes found hers across the quiet room. For a moment, nothing moved. And then, the most powerful Alpha in 7 territories said 2 words. "Leave it." Act 1. The healer and the room. Let me tell you who Senna was before I tell you what she did. She was 26 years old. An Omega from Greywood Settlement in the southern reaches a place far enough from the capital that the royal court was something you heard about in traveler stories rather than something that touched your actual life. She had trained under her mother, who had trained under hers. 3 generations of women with the healer's gift, not the rare, dramatic gift of battle healers who could close wounds in minutes. The quieter kind, the kind that required patience and precision, and the specific willingness to stay in a room with someone whose pain was making everyone else leave. She had worked for 4 years in the Greywood Settlement healing house before the palace appointment. She had not applied for it. A palace physician had visited Greywood on a routine talent assessment part of the Alpha King's initiative to bring capable healers from the outer settlements into the central healing wing. He had watched Senna work for 2 hours and submitted a recommendation that evening. "She doesn't flinch," his report said. "Most healers flinch. She doesn't." This was how she came to the Iron Mark Capital, how she came to the palace healing wing, how she came, on her 9th day, to stand in the doorway of room 7 and be briefed by the head healer, Mira, on the nature of the patient inside. The briefing was brief. "The Alpha King has a chronic shoulder condition rooted in old scar tissue," Mira said, her voice carefully level. "It causes periodic locking and pain. He has agreed to a healing assessment." "What are his previous treatment notes?" Mira hesitated. "There are none." Senna waited. "Previous healers were unable to complete a thorough assessment," Mira said. "The patient is particular about being touched, especially on the back." "How particular?" "Particular enough that I'm sending my newest healer," Mira said. "Because experienced healers know what to expect when they walk in there and have already decided to be careful. I need someone who hasn't decided anything yet." Senna looked at the door. "What's in there?" "A man with 11 years of untreated scar tissue and 9 bodyguards," Mira said. "Do exactly what you would do in any assessment. Nothing more." She opened the door. The room was large by healing wing standards, more of an anteroom than a treatment chamber, with a proper hearth and tapestries that suggested someone had made deliberate efforts to keep it from feeling medical. The 9 guards she'd been warned about were present, arranged in the specific, practiced way of men who had been doing this for a long time. They assessed her in the 3 seconds between the door opening and her first step. Senna assessed them back, then moved past them. The man sitting in the healer's chair by the window had his back to her. She had seen his formal portrait in the council hall entrance. Every palace staff member was walked past it on their first day as part of the orientation tour. The portrait showed a man in formal regalia, holding himself with the specific composed authority of someone who had been painted before and understood the exercise. This was different. He was in plain shirt and working trousers, the formal layers set aside. The shirt was open at the back for the assessment, and Senna saw immediately what she was dealing with. The scars ran from his left shoulder blade down to his lower spine in uneven, devastating lines. Old, burn damage severe, the kind that told a specific story about a specific event. The skin had thickened over years without proper treatment, pulling the surrounding muscle into compensating patterns that she could already read in the set of his shoulders. She approached. "I'm Senna," she said. "I've been assigned to your assessment." A pause. "I know," he said. His voice was lower than his portrait suggested. Controlled. "Begin." She began. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, starting away from the primary injury site, establishing what the body's overall patterns were before she addressed the specific damage. Shoulders. Upper arms. The junction of neck and trapezius. Everything was tight. Everything had been compensating for too long. When her hands moved down his spine toward the central scarring, she was focused on the muscle pattern beneath her fingers, reading what the tissue was telling her. Her hand moved automatically, following the tension, and landed on the scar. She felt the texture change under her palm, and knew, in the same moment, that the room had gone silent in a way that had nothing to do with professional quiet. She did not move her hand. She was still reading. The muscle beneath the scar was significant, dense, locked in a pattern that had been holding for years. Whatever had happened here had not been treated afterward, and the body had built its own architecture around the damage. She was still reading when the guard started speaking. She was still reading when Kalen turned his head and said, "Leave it." And then she looked up and found those gray eyes watching her with an expression she had seen before, not in the palace, not in any formal context, in the settlement, healing house, on patients who had been managing something painful for a very long time and had just, unexpectedly, been found by someone who could see it. "Does it hurt?" she asked, the way she would ask any patient, the way she had asked hundreds of patients. Several guards shifted. Behind her, someone inhaled sharply. Kalen studied her for a moment. "No," he said. "Good," she said, "but the muscles surrounding the scar are severely contracted. Your spine has been compensating. That's why your shoulder locks." A silence. One of the guards exchanged a look with another, because she was right. The shoulder locking had been documented for years. Prescribed medications, suggested surgeries, recommended rest. None of it had addressed the actual source. Senna adjusted her pressure slightly, pressing along the hardened tissue with careful intent. Kalen's shoulder tightened for half a second. The guards moved. And then, quietly, slowly, he exhaled. A long breath, the kind that takes time to leave. "Your body remembers the injury," Senna said, "even when your mind has moved past it." His voice, when he answered, was flat with something that wasn't quite absence of emotion. "My mind hasn't moved past it." She didn't ask what had caused it. Healers learned quickly that some injuries came with stories that opened better on their own than under direct question. She continued the assessment. The room remained absolutely still, 9 guards watching every movement, waiting for the moment their king lost patience, waiting for the moment Senna made a mistake. The moment didn't come, because Kalen simply sat there, his back beneath her hands, and let the assessment continue. After a long silence, one of the guards spoke confusion, audible even in his carefully controlled voice. "My lord, should we bring the physician?" Kalen didn't look away from the middle distance. "She is the physician," he said. "Act 2, 3 sessions a week." "Several weeks," Senna said, when he asked how long treatment would take. 3 sessions, per week, for approximately a month. The room processed this. One of the senior guards stepped forward. The Alpha King does not remain in the healing wing for several weeks. He has several weeks to manage a chronic condition that has been worsening for 11 years, Senna said, without looking at him. Or the shoulder continues locking at unpredictable intervals. Those are the options. The guard looked at Kalen. Kalen looked at Senna. He flexed his shoulder slowly, the first test, the first small movement that confirmed what she'd said was true. Not fixed, not yet, but different, less locked than it had been an hour ago. Tomorrow, he said. By the end of the first week, something had begun happening that none of the guards had prepared for. The Alpha King started arriving early. The first time, Senna assumed it was coincidence. The second time, she noted the pattern. The third time, she walked in to find him already seated in the chair by the window, looking out at the palace courtyard below, and simply began preparing her materials without commenting on it. "You're early again," she said, not as an observation, more as a marker of the fact that she had noticed. He didn't turn from the window. I had no other obligations. She raised an eyebrow at this, because she had seen his schedule, and it was not a schedule that produced idle mornings, but she said nothing. She began the session. Heat first a warmed compress over the central scar tissue to soften the area before she worked it. He lay on the healing table with the specific stillness of someone who had learned to hold themselves completely controlled even at rest. As the warmth spread through the contracted muscles, Senna began her methodical work. "You've done this before," he said, midway through the session. "Worked with patients who don't like being touched." "More than you'd think," she said. "Injury creates avoidance. The body learns that being touched means pain. Unlearning, that takes time." A pause. "Is that what you think I'm doing? Avoiding?" Senna considered this honestly. "I think you're protecting something," she said, "which is different." He was quiet for a long moment. "The men who caused this," he said eventually, his voice still level, still controlled, in the way of someone describing a distant event, believed the fire would end my bloodline entirely. Senna's hands continued their work without pausing. She had learned that people talked more easily when the person listening wasn't watching their face. "The keep," he continued, "was locked from the outside. Accelerant had been spread through the lower levels. It was intended to be complete. How did you get out?" A pause. Then, dryly, "Through a wall." Behind her, one of the guards spoke quietly. He pulled the stone from the frame, with his hands. Senna's hands stilled for just a moment. The fire had been burning for how long? The guard. Approximately 40 minutes before he came through. Senna resumed her work. "You should not have survived that," she said, simply, as a fact. "No," Kalen agreed. "I shouldn't have." A muscle band near his shoulder blade released suddenly under her pressure, the specific give of tissue finally letting go of what it had been holding. Kalen inhaled sharply, not in pain. In the specific surprise of a body finding relief in a place it had stopped expecting it. "There," Senna said quietly. He moved his shoulder experimentally. The guards nearest him watched, unconsciously mirroring the movement with their attention. The stiffness was still there, but something had shifted. "Winning," Kalen said, after a long pause, didn't erase them. "No," Senna said. "It doesn't, but you already knew that." He said nothing. She continued working. Act 3, The Man Who Came Back. The message arrived during the 5th session. One of the guards came through the door with the specific quality of urgency that well-trained people used when the news was significant, but they were choosing not to show it. "My lord," the guard's voice was carefully level. "There is a man at the palace eastern gate requesting audience." Kalen didn't move from the healing table. "Name." The guard hesitated for the space of one breath. "Heron Voss." The room changed. Not in volume, no one raised their voice. But the temperature of the air shifted, and Senna felt every muscle beneath her hands contract simultaneously, the precise, involuntary tension of a body receiving news that the mind is trying to process calmly. "Voss," Kalen said, very quietly. "Yes, my lord." Senna kept her hands exactly where they were. She had been in the palace long enough by now to have heard the name. Everyone in the capital had heard it spoken carefully, at low volume, in the same sentence as the burning keep and the night that had changed the succession history of the Ironmark bloodline. Heron Voss, the lord who had signed the order for the fire, who had been believed dead for 9 of the 11 years since, who had apparently not been. "He sent a message," the guard continued. "He says, A pause. He asks whether the scars have healed. The contracted muscles beneath Senna's hands turned to stone. She pressed carefully not to continue the session, but simply to maintain contact. To keep the bridge between her hands and his back that she had been building across 5 sessions and several weeks of careful, patient work. "Your shoulder," she said quietly. Kalen turned his head slightly to look at her. "It will lock again if you go into that meeting carrying this." She pressed gently along the central scar. "Let me finish." One of the senior guards made a sound. "My lady, the man who—" "I know who he is," Senna said, without looking away from her patient, "which is exactly why I'm finishing." Silence. Then Kalen laid his head back down. "Continue," he said. She worked for another 20 minutes. Slow, deliberate. The contracted tissue gradually softened under sustained attention. The shoulder released. The compensating patterns eased slightly. When she finished, Kalen sat up. He tested his shoulder, rotated it twice. Then he stood and looked out at the courtyard for a long moment. "For 11 years, he said, "I carried that night the way a soldier carries a wound that was never properly treated. It changed how I moved, how I stood, who I let close." Senna began gathering her materials. "Wounds do that," she said. "When they aren't treated, the body builds itself around them." "Yes," he said. Then, after a pause, "And when they are?" She looked at him. "The body remembers what it was before," she said. Slowly, it remembers it was built for more than protecting the wound. Kalen was quiet. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was not the first time he had observed this, but the way he said it now was different from the first time. Less observation, more something else. Something that didn't quite have a formal name in the language of Alpha Kings and Palace protocol. "I treat injuries," she said. "Not reputations." The corner of his mouth moved, barely, the smallest possible gesture. "You've said that before." "It's still true." He turned toward the guards. "Bring Voss to the Eastern Council room, not the throne hall." A pause. "And tell him I received his question." The guard moved immediately. Kalen picked up his formal jacket and turned back to Senna. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He left. Senna stood in the empty room for a moment after the guards filed out. She had been in the healing work for 4 years. She had treated battle veterans with wounds that had never been named, burn survivors whose bodies had rebuilt themselves around damage, people who carried injuries so old they had forgotten they were carrying them. She had not, until now, treated a patient whose injury was 11 years of isolation that had slowly become its own kind of wound. She picked up her satchel. "Miss." She turned. One of the younger guards had stayed behind the one who had, she'd noticed, been watching the sessions with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for them to fail and had instead watched something else happen. He looked faintly like he was trying to find the right words for something. "He hasn't." The guard stopped. Tried again. "He's never let anyone this close before." "I know," Senna said. "You should know what that means." "I'm beginning to understand." The guard nodded once, then left. Senna stood in the empty room alone. She thought about the way Kalen had tested his shoulder after the session, the careful, deliberate rotation of a man confirming something he'd stopped expecting. She thought about 11 years of every healer stopping when their hands came close. About what it did to a person, over 11 years, to have every potential help withdraw the moment it got near the part that needed it most. She picked up her satchel. She would be back tomorrow. She had said so. She kept her word. Act 4. The Eastern Council Room. The meeting with Voss took 3 hours. Senna did not learn what was said in the Eastern Council Room. She did not ask. What happened in that room was not hers to know. What she learned, the following morning, came from the quality of the silence in the healing wing and the way the senior guards looked at each other when they didn't think anyone was watching. Voss had not come alone. He had come with documentation evidence, apparently, that the conspiracy 11 years ago had been broader than anyone had confirmed. Names, arrangements, a full accounting of the network that had built and executed the plan for the burning keep. Why he had come now, with this, was something the palace was still deciding how to interpret. What Senna understood from the way Kalen arrived at the session the following morning, the specific quality of how he held himself, the set of his shoulders, was that something had shifted, not resolved. Not finished, but shifted, the way the ground shifts after a long-held tension finally releases. He lay on the healing table without speaking for the first 10 minutes of the session. She worked in silence. It was a skill. Silence the kind that felt inhabited rather than empty. The kind that said, "I'm here," without requiring any particular response. After a while, he said, he came to confess. Senna's hands continued their work. "He's dying," Kaelin said. "He wanted someone to know the full account before he did." "Did you know he was still alive?" "I suspected. I had no confirmation. Does it change anything?" He considered this for a long moment. "It confirms things I had believed for 11 years without proof. Whether that changes anything." A pause. "I haven't decided yet." Senna pressed carefully along the central scar. The tissue was more responsive than it had been on the first day. 3 weeks of consistent treatment, muscle memory being slowly rewritten. "People think healing means the wound disappears," she said. "It doesn't." "No, but it stops determining every decision." She adjusted her pressure. "The scar stays, but it stops being the loudest thing in the room." He was quiet. "You came every session," he said eventually. "I said I would. People say things." "I know," she said. "I say what I mean." Another silence, different from the ones before, lighter. "The physician Mira told me," he said, "that she sent her newest healer into this room specifically because you hadn't learned to be careful yet." "That's accurate," Senna said. "She meant it as a strategy." "I know." "Was it?" Senna considered. "I didn't know the room's history when I walked in. My hand moved the way it always moves, following the tension in the tissue. I didn't make a brave decision. I made a professional one." "And now?" he said. "Now that you know the room's history." She pressed along the final section of the scar. The muscle beneath released cleanly, the best response she'd had in any session. "Now I come back," she said, "because the treatment isn't finished." She stepped back. He sat up slowly, testing the shoulder as he always did, the small, careful rotation that had become their marker of progress. He rotated it once, twice. He stopped on the third rotation. "That's the best range you've had?" she confirmed. "Yes." He sat still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her directly. The full weight of those gray eyes, the reading attention she had come to recognize as simply how he processed things that mattered to him. "Why do you stay?" he said. "Others have left. Others left the moment they understood what they were walking into. Why do you keep coming back?" She met his eyes. "Because someone has to," she said, "and because you let me." The room was quiet. "That," he said finally, very quietly, "is the only reason that would have been enough." Epilogue. What the sessions left behind. The formal treatment concluded at the end of the 4th week. 12 sessions, 3 per week, as she had prescribed from the beginning. The shoulder condition had improved significantly, not eliminated, because that was not the nature of old scar tissue, but managed. The locking episodes had ceased. The compensating patterns in his spine had begun to correct. His range of movement was broader than it had been in, by his own estimate, approximately 8 years. Mira filed the treatment report with carefully professional language, and absolutely no personal commentary. The guards filed nothing. But Senna noticed, in the final week of sessions, that there were 2 fewer of them in the room, then 3 fewer. By the last session, there were 4 still present, still attentive, but distributed differently, less like a wall between their king and a threat, more like men doing a job they no longer considered urgent. She came for the final session on a morning when the first autumn cold had reached the capital, the kind of chill that came down from the northern passes and changed the quality of light through the palace windows. Kaelin was early. Of course he was. He was standing at the window when she arrived, which had become his habitual position, looking at the courtyard below, the city beyond it, the territory that extended outward in every direction from this center point. "Last session," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't move from the window. She prepared her materials. The ritual of it, towel, warmth, oil, had become familiar to both of them in the specific way of shared routines that accumulate meaning without announcing it. He settled on the healing table. She worked. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what you said. That healing means the wound stops determining every decision." "And?" "I think I haven't let it stop in 11 years, he said. "The wound, the scars, the night." A pause. "I think I made them the reason for most of my decisions. Not consciously, but they were always there. In the room." determining what I allowed and what I wouldn't. That's what untreated injuries do, she said. They become the architecture. Yes. Another pause. You dismantled some of that. Your tissue did the healing, she said. I just gave it conditions to work in. He turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. Stop being modest, he said. She almost smiled. It's accurate. It's incomplete. He turned back. You came back. Every session. You didn't flinch, and you didn't perform courage. You were simply present. That is not nothing. She pressed along the central scar one final time. The tissue responded cleanly. The shoulder was free. It's finished, she said. He sat up, tested the shoulder. The rotation was clean and full. He stood and faced the window. The treatment is finished, he said. What happens to your position in the healing wing? I have other patients, she said. The assignment continues. Good, he said. Then, after a moment, I may need maintenance sessions. Scar tissue requires ongoing work to prevent regression. It does, she agreed. Then I'll need a healer who knows the treatment history. You will. You're the only one who does. She looked at his back, at the scars that were still there, would always be there, and that had, over 4 weeks, become something different. Not gone, not ignored, known, treated. Part of the whole rather than the defining center of it. I'll be here, she said. He turned and looked at her the way he had been looking at her. She realized, since approximately the 3rd session, not with the assessing attention he turned on council lords and border negotiations, not with the managed distance he kept between himself and most things, with the specific unguarded quality of a man who has discovered, unexpectedly, that someone knows where the wound is and has chosen, repeatedly and without being compelled, to come back to it. You said, he began, that you don't treat reputations. Yes. What do you treat? She held his gaze. People, she said. What's actually there, not what the portrait says. He was quiet for a long moment. The portrait, he said, is inaccurate in several respects. I know, she said. I've been treating the actual version for 4 weeks. Something happened in his expression. The smallest possible movement, the faintest loosening, in a face that had been held precisely controlled for 11 years, of something that had been very tightly managed. Senna, he said. Yes. Stay. Not as a command. The way he'd said leave it on the first night, something that was not an order but a request so carefully made that it barely sounded like either. The specific register of a man who did not know how to ask for things, and was trying anyway. She looked at the window, the autumn light, the courtyard below where ordinary life went about its business. She looked at him. I'm not finished with the maintenance schedule, she said. No, he agreed. Then I'll be here tomorrow. Yes. And the day after. Yes. She picked up her satchel. The scars won't disappear, she said, at the door. I want to be clear about that. I know. But they stop controlling you, she said. That's what healing is. Not the absence of the wound. The presence of something stronger. He looked at her from across the room. I'm beginning to understand that, he said. She left. And behind her, in the room by the window, with the autumn light coming through, and the scars that would never disappear, the Alpha King of Ironmark stood and breathed, fully, freely, for the first time in 11 years. Not because the wound was gone. Because someone had stayed long enough to let him stop protecting it alone. He hadn't been touched in 11 years. Not because no one had tried. Because he had never let anyone stay. She stayed. Not out of bravery. Not out of strategy. Because someone needed to. And she was there. And she kept coming back. That was the whole of it. And it was enough to change everything.